So, is that our guest speaker?
Yeah.
Yay, hi. Welcome.
Francesca is going to help lead today.
Hi.
And Naiya is our special guest.
I see some familiar faces. I saw Rebecca earlier.
I've been in SUP, but I left briefly last semester. I met Naiya during my last year of high school because we both got this great scholarship that like covers full tuition and kind of selects like 10 people from like each major city and puts them into universities. And it's all based on leadership and like what you contributed to the community. Nothing about race or your like income level. Like this is just purely like leadership and creativity. And so we were paired, and I wanted to ask Naiya how she chose the communications industry and specifically how her relationship with Newhouse has been.
So with me, for my journey to communications, it was more about finding what I actually loved and what I actually like to do. I definitely took that first experience going to college doing like what I thought I wanted to do, what my parents wanted me to do. So I actually started in health and exercise science. I did great. I'm a really great student, so I studied really hard and all that stuff. And then I just realized something was like my heart wasn't in it. And that's when I realized that I was still very much an extroverted person. I did theater my whole life. And so I wanted to do more of that, but I also cared a lot about people, about conversations, about the way we talked about things, how we communicated, what are we talking about? Those things absolutely infatuated me. And I couldn't really find a major to fit that until my friend told me about CRS. So that's kind of why I went more of the communications route instead of media per se, which I did end up taking a public communications minor in Newhouse. But I did care more about like exactly what we're talking about, why we're talking about things, the importance of discourse and how representation matters, what that means, how we take into different dialogues when we have different conversations with different people, like the dynamics in between human communication and then even like the way we communicate every day, movies, commercials, bus signs, everything we do every day is communication. So it's literally about how we interact with the world and with each other. And so that's kind of where it led me to, and also to be able to build and have like everyday worldly conversations is kind of why I went more towards communication.
And you're a recent grad.
I am. 2020.
And what is CRS? Or yeah, like can you like what is communications rhetoric? What's like the full title of your degree?
Yes, it's communication and rhetorical studies.
So you have a minor in Newhouse, and that's how you kind of were able to do the LA semester abroad. You say like your experience, I know you were an RA too during that, right?
Right. Yeah, so the SULA experience, which is Syracuse University in Los Angeles, was an amazing experience, especially going there with my idea of my research already in mind. With the SORT grant scholarship, I was able to get $5,000 to fund the research. So when I got there, it was like, oh snap, now I actually, yes. Say it again.
Source grant.
Oh, the SORT grant. So the SORT grant scholarship is actually a very new scholarship. They just started maybe when I was like a first recipient, so they're around their second year now, but they pretty much fund students for any type of independent disciplinary projects that they want to do, anything from creative to STEM, entrepreneurial, anything like that. And so literally I just applied for it. I told them what I was interested in, what I was doing. And I was already doing this for my capstone for honors. So it just ended up being a really big win-win for me. And so once I was able to get the scholarship money, I went to LA, where I was also able to study. And then SULA just has an amazing program where I met a lot of my professors who were already in the industry. So I had an amazing opportunity to interview them. Kip Conweiser is one of them. He's a movie producer, which I also got the opportunity to use like footage from our conversations for my project as well. And just being there and be able to learn so much from like the executives, the people that I was talking about during like all the prep for my research, to actually be there and see them was like, oh my gosh, yeah, fun creates creative. Yes, it does. So like in this $5,000 for a full academic scholarship, and then sometimes they have like summer scholarships as well. So yeah, so that's kind of how that happened. And so once I got there, it was more about meeting everybody, getting to all the people that I wanted to interview, which is getting a lot more no's than yeses. But that experience as a whole was just really awesome. And it's kind of the way I met everybody that was in. And while I was there, I had an internship. So that also really helped. And I was just very well connected, which really just learning my personal connection, which is also why being in communications is just the way I network, the way I talk with people. People are really impressed by the way I engage with them. So it's the small things that really got people over the edge to even want to speak with me, to take time out their day, because I know they're super busy people. They'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I'll talk to you about your project. So that felt really awesome, the way that I could display it in such a way that made people actually want to be a part of the project as well.
And is there any what kind of brought you to your research interests and questions? Was your interest in communications and then wanting to know more about the industry, or did you see a disparity in the conversations that you're having?
Yeah, I feel like there was always been a disparity in the media industry as far as representation of the kind of stories that are told. For me, my first experience on set was actually the Oscar award-winning movie Moonlight, and I was an extra. And so being on that set made me realize, I was like, oh snap, I'm here and we can do this. We can make movies about our culture. And it was really specific to me too, because it was about somebody from Miami. So it was already a subculture within that. And it was a full, mostly Black cast. And so it was just for me to be a part of a project that at the time we didn't even know was going to be such a major thing, a major level. We were just trying to tell our story. And so for people to have it and take it up so well, and for it to even be nominated and then win the Oscars was absolutely mind baffling. And so it was even in the conversations around how that happened, how, I don't know if anybody remember, but when we first got the Oscar, it went to La La Land instead of Moonlight. So it's just the controversy was just the care. I have never seen something like that, after the big Steve Harvey thing, then they make fun of it. But at least for me, with the Oscars, I've never seen such a mistake. So it was just out of all things, out of all times, you wait for that one specific, the big one out of all of the nominations, and you mess up on that one. It's just it's the nuanced things about the way things were handled. So it just made me realize I was just the care of which, and then I think at that time it was the only one that won the Oscar, at least from a Black star or a co-star entity kind of thing. And then years after that, I don't think any other Black stories were actually nominated or won, maybe one or two. And even last year, the only one that we won was for Hair Love, which I will talk about a little bit too. But even then, Harriet was also nominated, but I think those were the only two that were nominated. And the one thing that I say about the Oscars, which is my critique, is that a lot of times the movies that get nominated that are from Black creatives are usually a lot of things that come from our traumatic experiences, like Harriet, a slave movie. What else? 12 Years a Slave, that also one is also a slave movie. I can also name maybe a couple other, The Help, and then Green Book. So when you keep giving Oscars to these specific narratives, now what you're saying is we're only good when we're talking about traumatic parts of our history, those kind of things. So it's for example, The Photograph with Issa Rae, they didn't exercise that to put on the Oscars. So it's things when we try to just be our regular self, just be regular human beings as a Black person, it's never enough. It always has to be something more, something extra, something that is usually over stereotyped. Maybe Shaft, playing, or Training Day, where they have to be thugs. So it's just a lot of the times the only attention that gets seen or recognized are those stereotypic roles. And so sometimes we pigeonhole ourselves, even as Black creatives, to do the things that Hollywood likes so we can even be recognized. So a lot of the times acknowledgement and recognition that we have a hard time with, and then also the diversity and inclusion part. We always say diversity, but then we don't know how to actually effectively introduce the inclusion part, what that means to be included in a conversation. Even the way the Oscars is ran and how they pick, there is no form of ballot. They don't have to release that information, that kind of thing. So it is very much subjective. So there's things like that makes it really hard to just want to be an authentic creative, and then have to work through the fact that maybe not all your work will be acknowledged or recognized. And then does that mean that we still should, or put out our content, and what that means when your content is not seen as worthy as others if it's not made a certain way or sells a certain way.
So this whole entire thing that the only narratives that are really respected or awarded are ones that fit in the stereotypes. Right. Do you want to summarize what Kip Kronzer said, or do you want me to play the clip about how HBO kind of finally gave a shot to like a Black movie?
Yeah, I would just give like a quick overview. So this is Kip Conway. So he's actually, like I said, like a movie producer, but he was also my producer professor for when I was in Sula. And so it was just really amazing to talk to him, and the fact that he was a part of creating diversity as far as the change in big cable networks at the very beginning of cable TV was absolutely amazing for me to hear for the very first time. So I want you guys to hear it and see what you all think as well. But you know, understanding that as much as we are creatives, it is a business, and a lot of people do think like that still, even with your creative work. So yes, please play it.
Well, we should rewind that sense. To frankly, honestly answer that, I did not create a diversity culture at HBO, period. It's not me. The diversity of HBO is a result really of cable television at that particular time in history needing to find a niche audience that it turned out not to be niche at all, turned out to really be the dominant influencer, which was all people who grow up in cities, not just people of color, but people who grow up in an urban environment have a different attitude about themselves and the world than people who grow up in a rural environment. And that was really the original intention, was just where you grew up. Not, again, not how much money you have, which I think is the real issue more than race, is class distinctions, but where do you live? And what are you seeing and doing every day? And how does entertainment, what kind of entertainment do you want? It fits that. HBO is a great story for us. And frankly, it was great for them too. The timing was perfect. My brother is clairvoyant, and that's what happens when you're super honest. You see things. I believe if you see the movie Harriet, I believe in that. And I experienced that myself. When you're really clear and see the truth, you see the truth. And if you're not afraid to say it, you see it and then you say it. And that happens. Kern saw that independent film had very few places to go in the mid-90s. The need for franchise movies was just overtaking the studios since the early 80s. And the auteur film was harder and harder to make. So cable's place, Showtime, HBO, even Turner, these companies were coming about because literally the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was granting them carriage on satellites if they programmed for minority audiences and audiences that were not being served by NBC, which you can call sort of Nothing But Caucasians Network, or CBS, the Caucasian Broadcast System, or things that we used to call it all the time. ABC had one too. And so it was time. It was time. Cable was a way for the media empire to make more money. We had saturated the advertising market in free TV. It was now time to get subscribers to pay for TV. And that was the model of HBO. So what we did for HBO, and what Kern really told me to go and do, was he said, HBO should be making Miss Evers Boys, because HBO will be in everybody's home. And some movies should be in everyone's home so that they affect them on that level. And Miss Evers is that one. So I was like, you're right, Kern, absolutely. So this is our relationship. Kern has a vision and I go and make it happen. And then he makes it stay. We spent, but mostly myself, I suppose, in front of this, 6 years, getting passed on by HBO. They were like, no, we're not making it. Respectfully, as I can say this, they were convinced African Americans would not spend premium money every month for cable TV. I thought that was not only racist, but incredibly backwards. Every single city I'd been in the world, no matter how poor it might be, they always had money for a satellite on top of that metal hut or whatever in wherever I was. So clearly, when I was in China making movies or Mexico or wherever I've been, I've said to the governments over and over, and I said to HBO, people would rather die of starvation than boredom. And if you give them a nickel and they can entertain themselves, that's where it'll go. And they'll worry about the food. And in fact, everyone who puts a nickel in to be entertained, then now there's a community, and the community works out the food. And it all happened because the singularity of entertainment, because we're all driven by emotions, not really by our immediate needs. And that's a hard thing for corporate America to get. And so my job is basically to stuff it down their throat until they did. So I almost intimidated them. I intimidated them, actually, to making the movie and paying attention to us. And the result is that the movie ended up becoming the most awarded in the history of TV, and really confirmed for HBO that, in fact, that audience exists and is a powerful audience that actually influences more audiences outside of urban environments than the other way around. And the whole idea that, wow, urban America is a powerful tool was the mid-90s, and hello, Jay-Z. So there it is.
So even going through, like, even like weaving out through his personal expression of what he was saying, the fact that he had been into the rooms and the conversations that we had off camera as well was just really baffling. Like he said, like, you'd be surprised how they sat there and they just said that Black people would not spend their money. So they are not worried about advertising to them or creating their work. It won't go nowhere. It's not going to sell, which is pretty much why they took so long for them to make the movie. 6 years later, he pretty much forces them to get the point to see that this movie needs to be made. Backstory, I'll let you guys know. He sent it to Whoopi Goldberg, and Whoopi told them to make the movie or she was never working with them again. And lo and behold, HBO the next week made the movie. Pretty much understanding like the weight of your power of just being able to speak up, because no one's gonna understand the value of your work unless you kind of fight for it. And that's coming from someone who wasn't even a Black person trying to push a Black movie. Imagine me trying to do that. I probably wouldn't have been able to get in the door. It's that simple. But understanding that even at the forefront, at that point, having people try to advocate for you and then telling you you're not worth it, and then, you know, the story itself, but comes to find out 6 years later that the story was the most awarded movie that year. It got a NAACP Image Award as well as an Emmy. I don't know if you guys can see it at the bar on the side, but if you looked at the side of the bar, that was the Emmy that won for Miss Evers Boys. And it was the most awarded movie that HBO at the time had. And it was just like, wow, okay, so now Black stories now have worth. And so I think that has, even to this day, still kind of a thing where we have to prove ourselves more first in order to be trusted with our work and with their money. If you know the backstory to Get Out, Jordan Peele was given a lower budget than a lot of the movies that Warner Brothers or the people that actually produced the movies gave. And his movie made triple times that in the box office. And it wasn't until then where he got enough money to make a better project for us. So it's always kind of having to battle and having to prove your self-worth as a Black creative in an industry that already makes you feel like you have to work that much harder. So there is always this fight of like making sure we can get that representation, that acknowledgement, recognition, but also getting our foot in the door and making sure that we still are true to ourselves and our value of our stories, even if people may not agree as well.
So that was just like barriers to even get a story, like a Black story, like out in like mainstream media. Can you talk about like your the struggles that Tari and Chris kind of, and Tiffany spoke to about like getting into the industry, like as a Black creative?
Yeah, Tari Waribi is another Syracuse alumni as well. He is currently at AFI. He's currently studying at AFI. And he himself, as a Black director, just talks about even him as a Black man, as an individual, his story and his expression of how he tells stories is just so different. And that when he actually puts them to screen and into context, people all the time from all walks of life are just like, wow, like I never considered that perspective. I think a lot of the times media is so saturated, we think that we have this one universal experience or view, and we're missing out on the thousands of different versions of the same thing that we all might be experiencing, but in different ways. Like for him, it was like a short film about his breakup and how most of the time Black men are either seen as either super violent or not being able to tap into his emotions. However, the character that he played and that he filmed was someone who was emotionally vulnerable, had scars, who was hurt by this other person, and then they were just saying how they never saw a Black male in that role. So it's kind of allowing more stories to be told so we can get out of that one frame mind. And so like a lot of the times independent stories are hard to get out. And when we do, we see how like amazing everybody receives the perspective, and it's really nice and it's refreshing. And all we want to do is tell more of those stories so we can get that more into like the image of what people may think or may assume when they like see work, and not just what mainstream media pushes.
Do you want to summarize what Chris said in his interview? Do you want me to go ahead and play it about like the challenges of like the pressures that his parents put on him and the imposter syndrome that he faced? Do you want to summarize that, or do you want me to show the clip?
I'll say a little bit to it. And you said it really well as well. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these stories, to be honest with you all, is more similar than they are different as far as maybe imposter syndrome, if you all have ever experienced that. But I will definitely say, as a Black female and even as a Black creative, a lot of the times you always were told, even growing up, you have to work 10 times harder, you have to do just as much people, you have to go to the best schools, those kind of things, just to be able to compete and be of caliber, to be seen and appreciated for your work. And so these are the stories that we've heard. These are also the stories that we tell ourselves. So I want you all to see it on another level, where it's not just me saying it, but how other people that share my same identity also have these same experiences.
So I'm only going to play the first part of it, and then Tiffany, but you can say something before hers.
You know, just wants you to be the best version of yourself. It like wants to set you up for greatness, and like how they're just really tough on you. For me, the same. Like for me, it was with academics. So it really hurt me that like my graduation got canceled, because like for me that was like everything I had worked up for. Like your piano, like is my academic. Like all I know is school, and that's what I'm really great at, and that's what I do.
For
You
sure.
know, my dad was really tough on me with that. So just kind of talk about like just the expectations of the household, and like just how you kind of started in piano and like what that looked like for you.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, first of all, obviously, like as I'm sure you can relate to, there's the aspect of needing to be better than everybody else because of the fact that we're Black, you know. And I think that like my parents did an incredible job of finding spaces that were the highest caliber of training. Like the teachers that I studied with and the places that I studied with here in LA are the places that you should go to learn music. And they weren't musicians, and they just really did a lot of research and found all of that and spoke to other parents and all that kind of stuff. But like you said, when I was in those spaces, it's interesting because my parents didn't really talk about race very much, but it was just implied, you know. It was like kind of this thing where like they expected me to be better than not only all of my friends or all of my peers, but like anybody else in that space. And a lot of that I think has to do with the mentality that they already had, where it comes to you know, you have to be twice as good when you're Black to be qualified as good at something. And I think the other thing too that was charging their drive is the fear of.
There we go.
So I was just saying that the other thing with my parents was like the fear of failure, in that like it's weird because my family is on a whole like a very, like the average person in my family is middle class or upper middle class even, and everybody's doing financially well. But my grandfather was one of 13 from like a farm in the South, and so like he was the first generation to create this idea of like success and wealth, and like some of his brothers became doctors and all that kind of stuff, and most of his siblings own property here in LA now, and they're all doing financially well. But that being said, it maybe wasn't really like that when my parents were kids. And so my parents, they grew up in like, they were maybe not financially well off, but I think that they definitely knew what it felt like to work for things or to be struggling for something. And then when they became adults, my parents got married super young, and they weren't really supported by their parents. And so they had an even tougher time. Like my parents almost lost their house at some point. Like they had plenty of times before I was born and when I was an infant, when like they weren't sure if they were going to be able to make rent or like all of that kind of stuff. And they worked really hard to get to where they are now, where they also like own property and all of this stuff. And I think that when they were raising me, they had fears of their own, just what failure looked like to them. And failure to them looked like all of their friends that were like drug addicts or living in neighborhoods that weren't that great. Or, you know, I even had cousins that grew up in neighborhoods that weren't that great. My parents, I think, were very fearful of me falling into that or that becoming something that happened to me. And so they were one, dead set on making sure I was always busy and I always had something to do, and I was always going to be like trying to apply myself. But I think they took it to that extra level because they were so fearful of, I think they just saw how hard it was to make it, you know, as an adult, that they wanted me to have every possible good shot, you know, that I could. But like one story that I always think about is my dad. I got a C on a test once, and I got into I got into an argument with my dad and like told him why a C should be okay and why he should be accepting of it because it's just average, and I rarely got C's. And his response to that was he took me to Skid Row and was like, "Get out of the car." He's like, "If you want to be average, this is what you're going to be aspiring toward." And it's really interesting that, like, you know, I tell so many people that story, especially privileged people, and they're just like, a C, like how, like that's a good thing actually, or like, you know, like how the idea that a C would equate to one day being homeless is not the average person's thought. And my dad was just like, no, like if you're anything below like excellent, you're possibly going to fail. And it's something that I think like really gave me so much drive when I was younger, and then now as an adult, I'm like trying to reverse engineer it a bit to understand the things that were good from that mentality and the things that were maybe like adding to my anxiety and fear and worry, you know?
I love that because it's the honest and it's the truth, and I think it's surprising as well.
Yeah. So just about what Chris was saying was, and I'm really glad that you're all here to have this like really open conversation, because I don't even think this has even been said, like even in classes or with my, you know, regular friends either, is that on top of having certain ideas placed on you as far as what you think that the industry wants from you and all these things that you have to work with, there's also this internalized pressure that we feel and that we put on ourselves to be great. Because for us, it really is be great or fail. For me personally, I will say even how I got to college, for me, it was either I had a full tuition scholarship or I wasn't going to be able to go. It was that simple. So I worked my butt off for my entire life to make sure that I was the greatest candidate they've ever seen in their entire life. And it wasn't enough just to make C's. Like I had to only make A's and B's. If I brought a C home from school, I would hear it from my parents. And so it was just crazy to hear how I've shared similar experience with other people would share my same identities. And it's just because for us, the scarcity of life and even success is something that is so other to us that we have to literally go out of our way to extend it and to get it. And a lot of the times we are the token Black people of a lot of those situations. I say that all the time. I'm privileged to even be here because a lot of the people in my surroundings did not have the same opportunities as me to even go to school and go to college. So obviously our lives look a lot different. And I just think that it's crazy how that transpires even in our lives and the decisions that we make, and especially once we go into our careers and how we see ourselves and the imposter syndrome. And just another thing that we didn't play, but what Chris was saying as well is just like how if he would have seen more people in his role when he was younger, he probably wouldn't have felt that way. But he is a phenomenal composer. I didn't introduce you guys to him, but he's a phenomenal composer. He was actually nominated recently, just this past Oscars, for When They See Us. He worked on their composing project for When They See Us Part 2. And then he also did the composition for Green Book. So he's been nominated twice. So that just shows to how amazing his work is, but he's only one of how many composers that's happened to that happens to be African American. So it's just crazy how you still have to be that one Black person that overworks, that does your best, even in those spaces, to still be acknowledged and then recognized.
Yeah, so there's pressure that you give yourself and that outside pressure, obviously. But I remember from Tiffany's interview that you had with her, she kind of spoke to how it's important to just like give yourself grace and give yourself the space to just create. If you want to summarize your interview, and then I can play the clip that we selected.
Yes. So so with Tiffany is the baddest female in the game right now for producing. She works at Condé Nast, and she and me and her have a lot alike. And I felt for the first time she gave me a lot of advice as a young Black creative, especially as a woman. feeling all these things, hearing all these conversations that you guys have now heard, feeling like that all the time, 24/7, being so hard on myself. She really just told me, like, you know, your work is okay. Like, you don't need people to acknowledge you per se for your work to feel important. So I just want you guys to hear it from her. But for her to be in such a position where she is right now, and for her to say that just made me feel really awesome and reaffirmed as a Black creative.
To Black women, to allow yourself some grace. I say to just young Black creatives that your art is important, and even if people don't understand it, self-expression in itself is both a revolutionary act and an act of art. And so I have some stuff that I shot and I did years ago that I'm like, oh, what were you doing? But allowing myself that grace, and also knowing that in that moment, me just being a happy Black girl on a camera screen is enough. I say to people from Harlem, people from the hood, that like, that in itself is an identity, and it's an important identity. And I think that I used to be so embarrassed to be from the hood at one point. And now it's like, oh, this is a tool. Like, this provided me some common sense that y'all will never have. You know what I mean? And so in all of my identities encompassed, I think that I just realized that every portion of it offers me some perspective, and all of those perspectives are just as important as anybody else's identity. And there's no need for me to suppress it. If I can't come my whole self, I don't need to come.
Yeah, a lot of the times coming as your whole self as a Black creative, there is a lot of withholding. There's some times where I'm just like, I don't know if I'm allowed to do a lot of this, because you're in a space where everything that you do is critiqued, criticized, evaluated. And so being put in that space with something that's already so sensitive, where you're not used to maybe just being accepted overall. So now you're already put in this critique box. It's almost like this overwhelming pressure to be great. And so allowing myself to have that grace and not be so hard on myself first, and just allowing the art to kind of be authentic to me, and also for it to speak for itself, was amazing. And she also talked about, we didn't show, was about a pipeline, how her responsibility was to get in there and then to help others like her that have the same passion for those things that would be overlooked otherwise. And so a lot of the times I don't feel like other people understand or feel like they have a responsibility to anybody else. I feel like a lot of times it is the Black people who realize that they're the only few Black people in the room that feel responsible for making sure that other voices are brought in. And I don't just mean like other Black people, I also mean other people of color. We also tend just to be more inclusive with our diversity, because we understand it has to happen on a radical level, and not just saying that, okay, we gave the one person moonlight and then that's it, when there's still thousands of stories to be told. And so I don't think it's going to be efficient for people until we can look and be like, everybody feels represented, everybody feels normalized. And I still feel like we're going in that direction, which is absolutely amazing. And I just want to make sure we're doing right by the artists and right by the people. And so I know we didn't tell about Kip's part, but he was like, I asked him if race changed the originality of the script. And he said, I hope it does. And so one thing, and I know you're probably going to ask it later, Francesca, but since I'm on the roll right now, one thing I want to leave you guys with is just to not take a colorblind approach to your work and to your art form. When you have different types of stories, they need to be told in different kind of ways, because they can be misrepresented in some ways, or they just maybe need extra attention to detail. For example, I would even say there was a Nina Simone movie that didn't go well, wasn't created well at all, which showed Zoe Saldana as Nina Simone. Nina Simone is definitely a darker skinned woman, and then they had Zoe Saldana, they pretty much painted her in blackface. And it was incredible to me, the fact that nobody said anything was wrong. And even understanding that she, as a Black artist, she needs work. She's not gonna probably say no to this, and she probably could only say so much to the white executives that were about to pay her bill that week. So it's really heartbreaking to me when we can actually not only do this, but then put this out and then expect us to then spend our consumer dollars to then fund this project. So it's just like, to have that and to see that insensitivity level go to so far, it's like the fact that nobody in that room felt the need to say something that was wrong is the problem. And that's the reason why we need to have more different types of voices in those spaces, to be able to speak up for people like that, or even to acknowledge like, hey guys, are we going to consider anything might be wrong with the message that we're sending? So I encourage you to not have a colorblind approach, to ask yourself more questions of, am I doing this correctly? Can we do this a different way? Are we doing it? Like, make sure you're asking more cognate questions of your art, making sure that the message is still very relative to the people and the representation that you're going for.
Amazing. And now we're going to go into breakout rooms to like kind of have you guys discuss these topics. But right before, quickly, Naiya, can you speak to how this is kind of mirroring what happened on campus, not again SU, what's happening around in the country with Black Lives Matter and the movement?
Yeah, it's about not being heard or represented in ways that we feel are just. Like, it's almost as if, you know, screaming to be heard and allowing yourself to be in the position to be able to say, like, hey, here's our stories. These are the things that's going on with us. And then still having people depict whether or not they want to acknowledge and then recognize your work and what you're saying and your voices and your bodies and your work. And it's just almost like, it almost disavows. So I would definitely say it works as far as like representation, understanding that these people are important, our voices are important, our messaging is important, making sure that it gets distributed in a way that is allowing for people to have conversations behind them as well, opening them up to allow others to learn more about themselves through these conversations, which a lot of the time I think people think that it's like a one-way conversation. And a lot of the time it's not. A lot of the times we do look for people who don't know as much information to just listen. But it's also that time where you are allowed to say and have a conversation like, well, I don't know much. And what are ways that I can do to help amplify your voice? You know, sometimes it's more about extending help than understanding right off the bat, or understanding that it takes time for people to learn things, and what ways can we do that through communication, through visuals, through media. So that's kind of the way that I started my project, for people first to understand what it means, to see the disparities, to see people's experiences, and then work our way through that to see how we can actually just make a forward movement, and we can continue to amplify voices and not just talk about this, sit here and fester in this, but also more make, you know, movements towards making like actual advances.
Yeah, and in a short summary, Not Again SU is basically about like the grievances specifically Black students and Asian students were feeling during the fall semester from all the racist incidents. And then during the spring semester, the Kent and like his administration basically withheld food, menstrual products, and various other things to students. And they were really violent and aggressive towards like protesters, and they violated their rights. And right now the big push from those students are to get the school to acknowledge that they did that, because they still haven't. Like, they refuse to like have a statement from it, and they have a other set of demands, but that I think is the main one, and probably is the main issue right now in the country, just acknowledging the fact that like we have this as an issue and we need to talk about it. So yeah, now you guys need to talk about it. So one, what is something new that you learned that you didn't know before, like in this Zoom meeting? And if you didn't learn anything new, why do you think these conversations are important? Two, what do you think your role is in helping the industry combat these issues of diversity and inclusion? And how can your personal goal, mission, education, research, and industry experience align with this? So basically, how can your like vision as an editor, as a animator, how could like your role as an editor in projects like contribute to like the issues that we're having right now, or help combat them? And then what can you do today to become a more informed viewer, coworker, storyteller, editor, and human? This is basically falling back to the original poll question about like, what are you doing now? And so like, whether it's educating yourself or telling stories or giving spaces for these voices, we're curious to hear about your perspective.
Cool. So the breakout rooms will send you there automatically, and it'll keep you there for 10 minutes. Naiya is going to be in one of the rooms. Francesca's in one of the rooms. Brad, you're a leader in one of the rooms, sorry. So those are the 3 rooms. And so first, if you can introduce yourself, since it's like a mix of people from different schools. So if you've never met before, this is your chance to meet some people. And if you don't have your video on and you are capable of it, it might be good just for this conversation to put it on. I'll stay in the main room, so if you end early, come back here. And then if you want to pick one person from your group to be the speaker for when we come back, then we can hear kind of like a summary of what you guys talked about.
Group 2. But yeah, have you guys seen any, like, I don't know, how have you guys educated yourselves? Like, why is it, to me, I'm like, why is it that you guys like are so involved and care, and then like other people don't?
Well, I think that like, I mean, most people I know try to be pretty active. I think it's kind of like a bubble thing where it's like who you're around. Like a lot of people have different degrees to which they find like what they should, like a lot of people have a concept of what the bare minimum of their activity should be as a higher thing than other people do, I think. And it's just kind of like who you're around sometimes.
So key points from my room, since I was designated leader, would be the importance to listen. So just having open space for people's narratives, and their viewpoints, and being able to vet that in a structured and collegial environment, especially in the classroom. I guess that's where I was coming from, was from the classroom. And also what I find is changing in the last, even especially 2 weeks, is the ability for people to call out bigotry when they see it. Like there's no, like the polite, like, oh, grandma just said something racist on Facebook. I see that's no longer like acceptable. And I think that's great. That those conversations are being forced and people are being called out for, frankly, kind of unacceptable viewpoints. I mean, the fact that NASCAR just prohibited the use of Confederate flags, coming from semi-rural, very white upbringing in Florida, that's huge. That is, I mean, that's a cultural sea change. And so I find the last 2 weeks, while they've been painful, have also been really hopeful too.
So how about the other 2 rooms? Who is speaker?
I'll go because mine was really quick. But what we said is that racism is kind of a marketing ploy. Well, Jacob said that, so credit to him. That like in the sense that at HBO, the story of Kip, that they basically you said that it's a balance between like marketing and like racism or like bigotry. So it's like this idea like, oh, let's keep like this white narrative, but like let's also make money. And so that's kind of outweighing it. And Jason also said that he never really saw that like average is different for like certain people. Like that was a perspective that he didn't really consider. And that's like something that I also like seeing that interview was like, wow, yeah, average is really different for other people. And we also spoke about like how symbols and movies and things sometimes take a different connotation for different people in different cultures, and to just be aware of that and to kind of call it out, how important that is. Jason and Jacob both said that. And I was like happy when they both mentioned their involvement in like the protests and in the Not Again SU movement on campus, because they're both like guys, and it's just we talked about like how some circles or some people don't have the same viewpoints, but that's probably just like a bubble or like an echo chamber. Like we only reinforce the ideas we like or have. So yeah, I don't know how to summarize that.
Naiya, are you speaking for your group?
No, Shauna.
Wait, end it.
Yeah,
Okay.
we had like a good back and forth because we were kind of talking about how in Hollywood it's been proven time and time again that diverse or even like black leading movies like Moonlight or Girls Trip or Straight Outta Compton can be these huge hits, but for some reason they're always seen as novelty. Like, okay, yeah, it worked that one time, but we're not going to do it again. So I was asking Naiya if she saw in her research if there's a shift happening because there are so many prominent black producers and creators, like Issa Rae has the best comedy on HBO. Kenya Barris, streaming and network TV, dominates, and Ava DuVernay, like everything that she comes out with is kind of like shatters people's brains. So Naiya was saying like she wants there to be so many that you don't know them, because there's like piles of white producers right now. You don't know the name of every white producer. But the problem that I've seen, like when Kenya Barris talks about being a creator in Hollywood, he feels like he has to speak out and his voice has to be heard, and that they have to say, hey, we're here just to be noticed. So it is this strange catch-22 of that, you want it to be so ubiquitous, but it seems like to me, listening to them talk, in interviews, usually when they're at these roundtable discussions, they're usually the only black creator at the table. They feel like they have to speak out even if they don't really want to. So we had, that was a few points that we had, but we had more back and forth during our little session.
Yeah, I was able to talk a little bit more, especially to my group about, like exactly that point about like what about when we do have the Ava DuVernays. And then I also want you to know, like, even those people that you said, like Insecure is like one of the best comedies, right? And then you have Ava DuVernay who freaking killed it with When They See Us. So that also, and I say that to say the work that we pour into our work, the fact that we have to overextend ourselves as people, and then we show that type of effort in our work, and then we still do that, and then we break hits, we break box offices, and then we're still seen as novelty that one time. So it's almost like a slap in our face to keep doing that work and stuff. So that's why a lot of the times I was telling them, a lot of the times, even with the recognition part, a lot of times we're just there to do the work. We can't even so much focus on getting to that point, or like we want to take up space, but we also are still trying to hold space at the same time. So eventually, yes, I would love it to be so many creators that you just can't name the three, And so that was like my really big thing of just, and I was telling them that there's so many different like distribution outlets. There's Hulu, there's UV, there's all these other extra places, now with Quibi and everything, that there's too many ways to put out content, that there shouldn't be a reason why more diverse writings and narratives can't be shown or seen. So I think Netflix does a really, really great job with that. Like even now, like I follow like their Instagram page, like Strong Black Lead, to see what movies the categories that they're watching right now. They have Latin Excellence, which helps you understand more like subculture kind of things. So even things like that, which I think is great to kind of for people to be able to experience different palettes of different cultures of people that probably actually created their own work. So even things like that, which was a really awesome conversation I was really glad to have with my group. I will say the whole project itself is still being formulated, guys. So when it's actually all created together and everything, I guess I'll send it to Francesca and she can give it to you all to share, just to give more detail to, like, if you just want to know more about the things that we talked about. Yes, Documentary Watch 13 is a great documentary watch When They See Us if you haven't seen it. Just Mercy. And so even the things that we're doing now, like just don't be ignorant to the things that you now know. Call out people, call out yourself, check yourself sometimes about the things that we say when we hear people. I'm just making sure that the conversations that we're having are healthy and they're also helping with you and each other. So thank you guys so much for listening. And this is the first time I've ever actually been able to share my project. So you guys are the first to see it. So I really appreciate the time, guys. Thank you so much. All the silent claps.
Thank you.